In the tradition of Paganini, Sarasate, and Wieniawski, all the great virtuosos of the past, right up to Fritz Kreisler and George Enesco, composed for the violin. Among these giants, on the subject of whom sadly no sound film has been traced, no one more than Eugène Ysaÿe left the imprint of his violinist soul on his musical compositions.
J'ai entendu les rares enregistrements qu'il y a de Eugène Ysaÿe, et c'est quelqu'un qui m'a toujours fasciné par la musique qu'il a écrite, que je connaissais avant de découvrir ses enregistrements. Dans ces 6 sonates, on sent une grande... un discours rhapsodique, une grande liberté, une grande imagination, un sens des couleurs, un instinct de violoniste exacerbé, en même temps qu'une réflexion de compositeur.
Je suis venu chez Ysaÿe en 1926 parce qu'en Russie, vous savez, nous connaissons toujours que quand il venait, on disait, pour Kreisler, on disait le roi des violonistes. Pour Ysaÿe, c'était pas suffisant, le roi, alors on disait tsar.
Today, there are so many violinists that play really wonderfully, and that are not great violinists. And that was something, I mean, Ysaÿe was obviously a great violinist. Of that there could be no doubt whatsoever. Great violinists, as I've known, Enesco and others, they have had a great control of vibrato, for instance. They could control, they had so many different speeds, different amplitudes, different powers, and very often you find wonderful violinists with one vibrato. And Enesco had a range of slides, which was quite amazing. More different kinds of slides than any other violinist I've ever known. Any kind of portamento that a tenor would use, to sliding from below the note to hitting the note with the finger on top of it, and or changing fingers in the middle of a slide. He didn't have perhaps quite the command that Oistrakh had, but he was a great violinist because whatever he played was absolutely inspiring, shattering, overwhelming, real, genuine, not a note was wrong, and he had this in an innate way which was quite extraordinary. Kreisler had greatness in that it was a very personal style, which was always, how shall I say, always cultivated. I don't think Kreisler had the full range of demonic to the most elegant and courteous. He had the elegance and the courtesy, but he didn't go to the demonic.
What makes or breaks a Kreisler piece, you talk about Liebesleid, Liebesfreude, is the timing and the pace. And that's what Kreisler did so magnificently. Nobody played with more warmth and intimacy than Kreisler. You know, if you were to compare the sound of Kreisler to the sound of Heifetz, Heifetz would be like a knight in armor, you know, galloping towards the sunset, while Kreisler would be, you know, somebody with more intimacy, who would be more quiet, and who would just have an inner warmth in his playing. I feel comfortable listening to Kreisler play with piano, because I find, first of all, the most beautiful sound. But I always found that he was a kind of a inward, kind of intimate, gemütlich kind of fiddle player. You know, that you're sitting in a lovely drawing room and he plays the most beautiful gems and pearls.
Fritz Kreisler, the last of the violinist composers, enjoyed a long and glorious career. By contrast, Ginette Neveu's career was tragically brief. But before her death in an air crash in 1949, at the age of 30, she too had won everyone's heart.
I remember distinctly my first encounter and my first vision of Ginette Neveu, because I wanted to laugh when I first saw her. I didn't know why. Then she picked up the violin and began to play. Well, I would like to assure everybody, I didn't laugh anymore. I sat there stunned. She really hypnotized you with her presence, with what we now call charisma. I suppose she had that charisma, that conviction, which she absolutely transferred into her listener, that this is the only way and there is no other way, whatever she played. And this was so hypnotizing.
Moi, je l'appelais toujours le gladiateur, parce qu'elle avait des espèces d'épaules comme ça, et puis quand elle avait une chemise comme ça, on voyait ses épaules énormes avec la marque du violon ici, elle était, et puis elle parlait comme ça.
I expected her to be sort of brilliant and, I guess, sort of very graceful looking, very feminine, and a real, like, knockout player. But she was almost exactly the opposite of what I expected to see, because in the excerpt, it was at the end of the chanson, her eyes were just glued on the conductor, and she looked very intense.
lorsqu'il terminait la fin du troisième mouvement de César Franck. Attends. Ce do dièse un peu plus bas comme ça. C'était de la couleur. Peut-être qu'il y aura des gens aujourd'hui qui n'oseraient pas peut-être jouer ça un peu plus bas, parce que ce n'est pas juste. Mais qu'est-ce que c'est la justesse? Thibaut, la même chose. Dans la Kreuz. Dans le troisième Weise. Ce ré bémol, il disait un peu plus bas comme ça. Tu peux le jouer juste. Casals faisait ça tout le temps, la justesse, comme ça. Qu'est-ce que c'est, tu vois? C'était des gens qui faisaient de la couleur.
Color, a highly personal way of savoring each note, distinguished the style of Jacques Thibault, the most famous of French violinists. Menuhin spoke with great admiration of his inborn ability to handle a phrase without asking permission of the metronome.
Et j'allais, par exemple, travailler avec lui vers 11h du matin. J'arrivais chez lui, il portait une espèce de robe de chambre un peu déployée, comme ça. Il avait une cigarette qui lui tombait du bout des lèvres. Et il a peut-être même pris un petit verre de, je sais pas, whisky. Mais, ok, enfin. Et il était là en train de jouer comme ça. Et c'était ça la leçon. La leçon était que c'était un homme fait violon, un violon devenu homme.
For me, you know, something about the sound is what you hear in your ear, what you hear in your head, and somehow it goes into the physical aspect of it. Because I feel if you don't hear it, you're not going to do it. Or if you hear it and you can't do it, you're going to quit.
J'ai passé des heures, quelquefois, à imaginer ici le son que j'entendais à l'intérieur de moi-même et d'essayer de ne sortir le son au violon que lorsque ça concordait absolument avec ce qu'il y avait dedans. Évidemment, c'est une science. Évidemment, c'est un travail énorme.
You take, for example, somebody like Stern, who, even as a young man, was already sounding differently. It's almost like he was saying, you know, I don't want to sound like all these old guys. I'm going to sound like me. And so you can hear in the slides, you can hear in the shift. It's Isaac. It's totally different. There is a kind of a purity to it. He could really turn a phrase with simplicity that would make it eloquent.
Ce que j'aime chez Isaac Stern, c'est le côté rock du violon. Il a un son qui n'est pas toujours d'une pureté ou d'une précision, mais c'est ça qui fait sa spécificité, je trouve. Il a aussi une manière de jouer faux qui sonne juste.
There is a romantic emotional involvement, and there is a pure emotional involvement. Of course, he would be very, very dramatic. There's an old joke about Heifetz. where after a concert, some lady comes to him and she says, "Oh, Mr. Heifetz, your violin sounded so magnificent today." And he picks the violin and he said, "Funny, I don't hear anything."
There is in the very nature of the violin as an instrument an element of mythical, even mystical resonance.
For 5,000 guineas, thank you. 6,000, 7,000.
All the great virtuosos have played on violins by Stradivarius or Guarnerius del Gesù, magnificent instruments which are often given the credit for the sound their players produce from them.
For 13,000 guineas. 14,000. 14,500. Any more?
Quand j'avais 13 ans, un homme très gentil m'a permis de choisir mon premier grand instrument, le Kevenhüller, que Stradivari a fait quand il avait 90 ans. Il y avait encore des Stradivari dont le prix était à la portée, même des mécènes. Aujourd'hui, les prix des anciens instruments dépassent toute mesure.
It's cheap, though, isn't it? Cheap? Inside here it says 1737. That's the year.
C'est le Stradivarius de 1716, qui vient d'une collection Stockholm. C'est là-bas que j'ai acquis celui-là.
Nathan Milstein was a Strad man. He only played on Strads, while somebody like Heifetz tried Strads, but he was basically always played on Del Gesù.
Alors, maintenant, est-ce qu'on pourrait demander à Leonid Kogan de nous montrer son violon? Je sais que pour un artiste tel que lui, c'est presque une part de lui-même.
Vous avez trouvé la bonne formule. C'est même la partie majeure d'un violoniste, le violon.
Et ça n'est pas un Stradivarius. Qu'est-ce que c'est exactement?
Это Guarnerius del Gesù.
De quelle année?
1733 года.
1733.
I think that Oistrakh, who had a wonderful sound, did not play on a particularly wonderful violin. He played a Strad, but it was not one of the great Strads. But yet he produced magnificent sounds from it.
Имя Марсик Страдивариус.
Sie heißt Marsi Stradivarius.
Марсик.
Marsic.
Она принадлежала знаменитому профессору французскому Марсику.
Sie hat gehört der berühmten Professor Marsi.
It was a good fiddle, but nothing. So, again, which again brings you the same conclusion, that the sound comes from the individual, not from the instrument.
И качество инструмента важно, и состояние инструмента. Вообще инструменты итальянские, старые инструменты, они достаточно капризны. Они очень, так сказать, чутки к изменениям климатическим, атмосферным и так далее.
Atmosphärische Änderungen, die Atmosphäre und die Veränderungen.
Так что нужно, в общем, относиться к ним как к любимому ребенку.
C'est comme mon fils, c'est comme mon frère, c'est mon ami.
Eh bien, je suis très heureux de pouvoir posséder ces deux violons qui me permettent d'exprimer tant de sentiments.
Il y a une différence sensible entre l'un et l'autre?
Ma foi, oui. Le Strad, un son plus clair, plus brillant. Le Guarnerius, en échange, il a un son plus sombre. Je ne dirais
profond.
Plus profond. Non, le Strad aussi a beaucoup de profondeur. Mais c'est deux mondes merveilleux et deux mondes que je suis tellement heureux de pouvoir habiter. Dans n'importe quelle circonstance, je suis emparé, n'est-ce pas? Je suis protégé, oui. Je suis appuyé, je suis inspiré.
J'ai un violon ici qui est né en 1713. Il vivait long avant moi et j'espère qu'il vivra long après moi. Et moi, je ne considérais pas que ce violon est mon violon. Je suis peut-être son violoniste plutôt. Je ne suis qu'un passager dans sa vie.
For me, Schering was like a chameleon. He sounded like everybody. Good. But it's like everybody.
It's not that his playing lacks character. It's just, it's very well thought out and in very good taste, and it's really exquisite. So I don't think that there's anything lacking in it whatsoever.
I would always have a problem figuring out who it was. So I always have a thing with my wife. I said, who is playing? Well, I don't know who it is. Ah, it must be Schering. Because it's good.
And probably for me, his Bach was the most consistent with what I was looking for in Bach.
Violinists have a harder time to make pure music than pianists, because pianists cannot really do that much on the piano. They are immediately forced to turn the phrase. They don't have to deal with vibrato, they don't have to deal with shifting, they don't have to deal with sliding, they don't have to deal with bow speed. They got to deal with an instrument that basically you put down the key and you get a sound. And if you play a few notes in a row and they sound blah, you have to deal with music immediately. Fiddle players don't have to deal with music. Also, another thing that fiddle players have to deal with is an intonation. So pianists don't have to deal with that, with all of that. So they're immediately forced to think of a phrase. We don't have to think of a phrase right away. You know, we thank God that we can play something that would sound decent and in tune and without a scratch. So a lot of, you know, so some of the fiddle players, you know, sometimes stayed with the kind of concentration on all of the things that really take to make a violin sound good. And by the time you mastered all of that, you're 95 years old. It's no time for music. So those fiddle players who could do both, those are the great ones.
was kind of funny to see someone like Kogan play. He looked, I don't know, in a way he almost looked kind of panicked or uncomfortable when he was playing, but his playing didn't sound that way. I don't know if there's unity between Kogan and Oistrak's playing. I think there is a connection in sort of the seriousness they bring to their playing.
Вы знаете, даже маленькие дети в центральной музыкальной школе, им, так сказать, ну, знаете, вот так говорилось, так думалось, во всяком случае, вот будешь заниматься, будешь, какой страх, будешь ездить, посмотришь, пойдешь в Америку. Америка это была, в общем, ну, дальше, чем созвездие Скорпиона. Я всегда к Ойстраху относился, обожествляя его. Но уже еще во время войны, когда я был мальчишкой, в Оренбурге эвакуировали, во время холода и голодов, я по радио слушал очень часто рондо капричозо Сен-Санса в исполнении Давида Ойстраха. И я, знаете, ухом прилипал к этой самой громкоговорителю, так называемому, для того, чтобы слышать каждую ноту. Вот с тех пор у меня была мечта познакомиться с Ойстрахом. Гениальнейший скрипач, это король скрипачей.
I think I was like 16 or 17 years old, and I went to a recital, and he slayed me. He was my favorite fiddle player for like a year. You know, I would go through a lot of, I would go through a Heifetz period, a Milstein period, but Oistrach was somebody that actually I never fell out of love with. I just loved the way he played the fiddle. I loved his sound, I loved his phrasing.
I don't think his playing is necessarily geared towards charm or towards real rapport with the audience, as far as just trying to draw them into the performance. But I think people get drawn in listening to him by sort of sheer force of will.
His external appearance could be too easily misjudged, and yet I don't think his face can be misjudged. His expression, the wonderful freedom of the neck, the way he looks up and plays.
Like, he played with so much weight in his sound. Like, also just the way he looked, he was just so solid. He was right there, and he was completely in command without looking like it was any problem for him whatsoever. It was just naturally, everything was, at his fingers and completely under control.
I've never seen fingers change on a bow stroke at the frog as quickly as his does. I know when I saw him once, and I said, my staccato, it'll never be yours. It's much too slow. Oh, he said, you could learn that in 3 months. You'll discover it in 3 months. But I didn't. He was a man of incredible integrity. I only knew very few such artists. Some were free because they wanted to indulge themselves. Some were unimaginative and wonderful calculators. So they calculated the effects which came off and were wonderful in their way. Each time the same effect in the same way, predictable, and, after all, eclipses are predictable too. They're part of the great laws of nature. But there are two schools, the one that's utterly predictable and the other that's utterly abandoned. But he married, Oistrakh married the two.
Menuhin was the ultimate wunderkind on anything. Probably people will say, well, what about Mozart? Well, okay, well, that was a little bit back.
Yehudi était devenu la légende de Isaac Babel à Odessa. Tu connais le conte d'Isaac Babel qui disait dans chaque famille juive à Odessa, il y avait un petit garçon qui allait devenir le messie du violon.
A 12-year-old boy comes to the Berlin Philharmonic and plays Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms. That is already amazing in itself, such a feat. Is it conceivable that a boy of 12 could master 3 such concerti in such a masterful way?
It was the most heartfelt and straight to your heart kind of playing that anybody has ever heard.
There is only one word I could use in connection with Yehudi: magic.
Menuhin was the most natural player. Totally natural. Technically, sound-wise, tone-wise, it was natural. You listen to something like his, there's some recording of the Ronde de Lutin of Bazzini. Nobody better. With that interesting sound. It had like so many layers of color.
virtuosité, je n'ai rien contre. Je l'admire, je l'acclame, je trouve c'est magnifique. L'artisanat aussi poussé, une maîtrise aussi merveilleuse, c'est une chose à admirer et à cultiver. Mais il arrive un moment où cette même virtuosité se détruit parce qu'elle a besoin justement de la nourriture de la musique. Quand la musique ne nourrit pas la virtuosité se détruit.
One of the great things about Menuhin was his sound. The sound had a life to it that one cannot not describe. But he always had that sound, you know, all the time, whether he had a bad day or a good day or whatever it is. His sound was always something. It was like, you know, it's like a fingerprint. You know, that's you. That was him. And of course, he was always so, I don't know, people like to call it human kind of playing, but he would go right to your heart with whatever he played. It was a very, very special kind of player that it had a I don't know if you want to call it a humbleness.
Yes, Heifetz was a kind of a god, yes. Different than Yehudi in that respect, because Yehudi in a way was nearer, in a way. He was the angel who came down on earth.